So we're here to talk about the External Development Insight Report. So just to set some context for what we're doing here, this presentation is based on the data that we collected to support that report. So the data was collected in December of last year with a little bit of carryover into early this year, and it's over 200 developers and service providers. So it's a huge cross section of the industry. This is not just big players, not just tiny players. The data really tells us it's been a wonderful response from folks of all sizes, revenues. This is really a great snapshot of our industry. And today I want to give you an early look at some of that data, some insights into our thought process about how we went about both collecting it and interpreting it, and then just some highlights of what we learned. Um, as Chris had just said, my name is Dave Sanderson. I'm the External Development Manager at Phoenix Labs. I'm also a member of the advisory committee for the first time this year, which is a real delight for me and a treat. And then I am the co-author of this year's report. And thank you so much to Chris for all of his incredible support as we went through this process. And I also wanted to give a special shout out to Kelly Brunton, who was responsible for the wonderful graphic design that you're going to see in the report. She's done an absolutely tremendous job, and I wanted to say thank you to her. So whenever I do these presentations, I like to start with why. Like, why are we here? And the mission of XDS is to advance external development in games through knowledge sharing, B2B networking, collaboration, and industry stewardship. And the Insights report really serves that mission by equipping us all with valuable information that we can use to then make better external development decisions and just generally improve our industry. What to expect from the report from the presentation today is just some highlights of the report. It's not a deep dive. It's going to be available to you later today. I can't wait for you guys to get your hands on it. I welcome all of your feedback. There is a ton of detail and there's a ton of data. For today, we're going to pick a couple of highlights, and then we'll go from there. So don't expect this to be a walkthrough of the report. Expect this to be a glimpse into a few key pieces of it. One thing that I wanted to note about who we asked, and of that 200 developers and service providers, is that half of the service providers who responded this year, for them, it was their first time responding. And that's also true for developers. So what that means is the pool of people that we were consulting has changed dramatically from year over year. There's been a significant change in the service provider landscape in particular, and that's something we're going to get into soon. But really, it's worth knowing that the people who are contributing to the survey are evolving as our industry evolves. And as we kick off these 2 days of talks, I also just want you guys to remember that XDS Ignite is different than the conference in the fall. We're all developers here, and the goal of this is not to necessarily find new vendors or to really land the deals for a particular project. It's to share information. And so I really encourage you to be open and honest with each other, and I welcome your candor as well. And one final bit of housekeeping before we move on. We're going to try a little bit of a different Q&A for this presentation. We're going to try having a short Q&A session after each section. There's 4 of them. That's going to be moderated by Chris. I would encourage you to use the chat in Zoom. So if you have questions as they come up, drop them in chat, and Chris and I will kind of tackle them as they come up. If this turns out to be a total mismatch of how we should do this, no big deal. We'll move on. All right, let's get into it. So what are we going to talk about? The purpose of the Insights report is to gather that data and reflect it back to the community. And so I chose kind of 2 sections that we have had that are returning from previous years. That's the mergers and acquisitions section and the market conditions and trends section. But I also wanted to tackle 2 new sections that went into the report this year relating to how we adapt to COVID-19 and also related to diversity, equity, and inclusivity. So let's talk about COVID. That is kind of the big issue of the year, and understandably, it had a significant impact across the report. One of the things that is important to remember is that when this report went out, it was in December. So most service providers and developers had transitioned into that new normal. We'd already, we had a lot of track record into work from home, and we were settled into the new thing. However, it was before we had a lot of really positive news around vaccines. And so there was still a lot of uncertainty around like how long things were going to last. So just keep that in mind as you look at both the report and what I'm going to show you in a minute. And really, the most important thing that Chris and I wanted to try and capture with the survey this year was just how disruptive was COVID-19 to the business of external development. It felt huge, but like, what does the data actually tell us? And what do we learn? Well, the impact is actually less than you might expect. So just a couple of key highlights. Almost half of service providers saw an increase in demand since the pandemic began. That stands to reason. Tons more players are playing. There's a huge increased demand in content. And we are trying to keep up with that demand. 57% of developers saw no change in the amount of services they were buying, and 30% are buying more. So there is just more games, more demand, more external development. The legacy of COVID thus far is we need more games. We need more stuff. And one thing that was really interesting to me is that for 5% of service providers, COVID has a significant negative effect on their ability to do business. There were, and it's worth keeping in mind, there's also, if somebody went out of business due to COVID, obviously they wouldn't be responding. But one of the most intriguing things to me is that more people, 9%, actually said it has significant positive impact. So there are a bunch of reasons behind what that means for people, whether it's they're seeing increased revenue or they have more flexibility in how they source people. But the overwhelming impression coming back from the data is that this was really hard, but actually it kind of worked out okay so far. Now, I do not want to create the impression that it was all easy or that there's not a huge amount of hardship surrounded this. So to look at kind of the biggest challenges, we just asked people to identify what they found to be the things that are really holding them up, and we found quite a bit of consistency between developers and service providers. And that's, the restrictions on travel and the transition to work from home are really, really hard. In the data that we're going to see in a little bit, I'll get into why I think particularly the transition from work from home and the restriction on travel relate to each other as particularly challenging. But the key thing to remember is that because demand is increasing, we need more stuff, but our ability to connect with the partners that we need has fundamentally changed. We don't have the conferences in the way that we used to. I'm incredibly grateful to the XDS team for their ability to put on virtual summits, but it's not the same thing as we also reflected from last year. And really the ability to do site visits, to do business trips, it's just completely changed things. And so when you look at this, like, what do we take from all of this? And there's one quote from a developer comment that really kind of sums this up for me. And he said, "We now understand that everyone can work from home. External development is how we're all currently working." So I love this quote. It captures so much about what we learned in the report. Thanks to COVID, we're all external developers now. We also, as an industry, learned that we are highly adaptable, something that seemed impossible at the beginning of last year, like a complete shift to work from home, was not actually as impossible as it seemed. By making remote work the norm, COVID has changed how we think about building and recruiting teams. Competition for talent is more ferocious than ever, both across service providers and developers. And then for me, this quote also captures that current arrangements are exactly that. They're current. We're all looking forward to a different future, but it's not yet clear what that's going to look like. So where do we go from here? The short answer is, based on the data, we don't know. There is no consensus at all between developers or service providers about what comes next. There's certainly a desire for a return to quote unquote normal, but there's very little consensus, very little agreement even on what that's actually going to look like. And so what do we do with this data that we've collected? For me, I look at it as a benchmark for next year's survey. We've really lived 2020 was a very specific and unique year, and I'm grateful that we had the opportunity to grab as much information as we could, because I think what it looks like in reflection with next year's data is going to be really telling. So it makes me really excited for what we see and what comes next. All right, let's talk about mergers and acquisitions. It was really important to me that we include this section in today's presentation for a couple of reasons. First, there were quite a few high-profile acquisitions in 2020, and in the survey data, a significant number of respondents, both service providers and developers, expressed concern about market consolidation. They're really worried about, and the data supports this. Both service providers are worried about losing customers, and developers are worried about losing choice of vendors. It's absolutely top of mind for a lot of folks. But the second reason why it was really important to me to talk about it today is that there's a really interesting disconnect between the level of concern that's expressed and what the data is actually telling us about what's happening in the market. So I'd like to show you what I mean by looking at some key stats here. Okay, so let's look at this from the perspective of someone who assumes there is a lot of market consolidation taking place. Half of service providers have been approached for M&A conversations, which is more than last year. And a further 16 couldn't disclose, so maybe it's even higher than that. 11% have acquired a service provider in the last year, and that's increased as well. So that obviously would seem to indicate there's an increase in market consolidation. Almost 40% of respondents are open to being acquired, but that's down for the second year in a row. So maybe that could mean that less companies are open to being acquired, but maybe that means that everybody who wants to be acquired has been. And then finally, 15% of service providers are looking for new acquisitions, which is down from 6% last year. So perhaps it might feel like fewer service providers are looking for acquisitions than previous years, but maybe we can just chalk that up to COVID and some uncertainty there. So I can understand why when people look at the market, they think that there is a ton of M&A, there's a ton of market consolidation. These aren't baseless thoughts to have, but I don't actually think it's accurate, and I'll show you why. So most service providers have neither the means or the interest to acquire other companies. There is some 23 acquisitions happened, but 15 of them came from only 3 companies. And the remaining 8 came from 8 different service providers. So that means, they're acquiring 1 each. And of the 103 service providers who responded to the survey, over half of them are responding for the first time. There is a huge diversity of people entering the market. And this is true on the developer side as well, by the way. But in terms of, is there market consolidation? Are there fewer options? Are there fewer people to work with? The answer is no. The problem is, and this matters, is connecting with them and finding them. So, and on top of this, let's look at, there's sort of 3 important factors coming out of the developer side of things. Nearly half of developers who contributed to the survey were also first timers. So the one of the things that's really interesting, and you see this borne out in the news, is that while there are high profile consolidation and mergers, often for the people within those organizations, that is a cue for them to leave and start their own shop. So yes, there have been mergers, there have been acquisitions, but there's also been an enormous number of new shops opening up. So while the old customers and the old providers may appear to be dwindling, there actually seem to be a lot of new ones coming up to fill that space. Another thing that's super important is that developers tend to work with a lot of service providers. It's for a quarter of people, it's 5 or less, but over half work with 10 or more service providers. So everybody has a lot of vendors. So the need is really high, and so the fear of consolidation makes a ton of sense. But also keep in mind, especially when this is from the service provider perspective, the outsource spend that's happening at developers is large across the board. It's not like it's being dominated by a couple of a few large sort of AAA providers. There's a lot of external development happening at all levels. So what does this all mean? My conclusion is that the problem isn't market consolidation per se. The problem is that every developer is hungry for new partners, and it's really difficult right now to connect the new buyers and sellers who are entering the market. There is also there's work to do, and there's people to do that work, but again, finding them is the issue. And that's where merger and acquisition concerns relate back to COVID-19 concerns. Like, our usual tools for connecting with external partners don't exist the way they used to, and we currently don't have good replacements. So based on what I've seen, in my opinion, M&A activity feels worse than it is because of COVID-19. The usual ways we see diversity in the market aren't available, so we assume that it isn't there. But it actually is. The service provider and developer landscape is vibrant and it is diverse. So kind of blaze through that a little bit. Again, I'm happy to take some questions there, or even anything that's come so far, or I can keep this train moving.
Yeah, Dave. Carla Rylance had a question from the previous section on COVID.
Sure.
Which was, were there any specific services that had increased demand due to COVID? So, for example, live services.
It was the place we didn't see it specifically in live services. What we saw it was especially in art, but there was sort of a general lifting of all ships, but art was the place where it, and supported disciplines was really where we saw it. So essentially, hunger for content. The COVID didn't kick off new games, it doesn't seem, but everything that was already there was being consumed so dramatically that a lot more content was going into those games. Now, sorry, and relating back to your question, does that mean that it was driven by live service? Probably. I don't think we have data specifically to support that. And the reason why I say that is that there has been an increase in outsource spend and demand across all platforms, with the exception of VR. But I think it stands to reason that it's supported by live service, but I actually can't point to a specific stat that would answer that question.
Another question, so in relation to M&A, Dave's from Ryan Faraji, and I can't remember if we sliced the data this way, but what region of the globe is the most M&A occurring?
Ooh, good question. We didn't slice the data by where the acquisitions were happening. We do have data on where the service providers are, and it's a pretty broad split. I couldn't tell you if the acquisitions are equally split across regions, but I can tell you that the data that we have is pulling from across the globe. It's not, heavily North America or heavily Asia or heavily Europe. It's a pretty even balance, including South America and other developing markets. That's a great question, and actually, I'm going to write that down because we should have that information, and we don't.
It's a good question, Ryan.
Yeah, thank you for that.
There's while you're jotting me on that note, Dave, there's a similar question from Michael Paul, not related specifically to M&A, but a more general question, which is, are new providers showing up in any specific regions?
Good question. And no, that's the thing that's really interesting, is that they're showing up all over the place. There is no dramatic increase that we can see in the number of service providers by region. Like they don't seem to be popping up disproportionately in any particular region. And I am speculating when I say this. I think it's because as some of these larger acquisitions are happening, they spin off new companies, and that's not focused on any one region. I think that there is the ability to start your business wherever you want. Doesn't seem to indicate that it's coming from one place more than so. If you're asking me, like, did all of a sudden we got like 15 new service providers in Malaysia? No, it doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be like markedly in one area over another.
Thanks, Dave. So Troy Smith from Capcom in Japan asks, is there data regarding a number of companies, so whether they're developers or service providers, that are looking to embrace work from home as a standard policy or only as an option going forward?
Yes. So we have data of how many, what proportion of people's staff, both developers and service providers, is fully work from home. We have data for what was that before COVID-19, and we asked what their expectation was going forward. Of do they think they're going to be maintaining that or going to try to return everybody to studio. There's not a lot of agreement on it. That's sort of one of the things I was trying to capture a little bit with the COVID-19 section of just there's a ton of uncertainty and disagreement. And it could be that, like, there's just a diversity of solutions. Like it's not that there's a whole bunch of wrong answers. It's just there could be a whole bunch of right answers, and it's gonna be highly individualized. The legacy of work from home seems to be competition. Seems to be that we're competition for talent is now much more difficult than it was before, because people are open to not requiring people to be in studio.
So great questions, guys. So Dave, you're off the hook for now.
All right, moving right along. Okay, so let's talk about diversity, equity, and inclusivity. And right off the bat, I want to acknowledge that this is a subject that's difficult for a lot of people to talk about. It brings up strong feelings in people, both positive and sometimes negative. And we saw that in some of the comments that to this year's survey. So I want to talk about this in two parts. First, I want to talk about a bit about how I personally think about diversity, equity, and inclusivity as it relates to external development, and why I think it should matter to all of you too. And second, and totally aside from my opinions, I want to talk about why we included DE&I section in the survey this year, what we asked, what we learned, and what we're going to do with that information. So why do I think diversity, equity, and inclusion should matter to all of us as external development professionals? At its most basic level, external development is about creating and fostering great partnerships. This is my perspective. It also means being eager to work with different kinds of people from all over the world. It means building partnerships based on fairness and mutual respect. And it means building great shared work environments. That, to me, if you can agree with those ideas, you are already a person who cares about DE&I. Awesome. Think about how many presentations you've been to at XDS or outside the studio where you've heard vendors talk about how much they want to integrate into dev teams, how much they don't want to have things thrown over the wall, how much what makes them important is how they work really closely with people. That's what we're talking about. DE&I in external development isn't about checking boxes or political stances. It's about creating work environments where people can show up as themselves. It's about creating partnerships where everyone can do their best work. And to me, creating genuine partnerships with external teams is a worthy goal for everyone here. And caring about DE&I can either be the thing that unlocks those great partnerships, or it can be the thing that really kills it if you choose not to carry or work against it. So, but the reason that we chose to include a new section about DE&I in this year's survey isn't about my feelings or my opinions. It's about using the survey for its intended purpose, which is to gather information about trends in external development and reflect that back to our community. This is a thing that is happening, that is a thing that's being talked about in our community, and it was important to me that we start to meaningfully collect data around it. And we decided to focus on two things. So first, internal considerations, and second, external considerations. Last year was the first time that there was ever anything related to DE&I in the Insights report. And it received a lot of positive feedback, but we didn't have data to back up the anecdotes. And we knew that's the subject on people's minds, and we wanted to understand how that shows up in external development decision-making. So in particular, how committed are developers and service providers to DE&I for themselves? And then how does that express itself, if at all, in external decision-making? And so what did we learn? We learned that DE&I is well established as a worthy goal internally at developers. 78% of devs have something explicitly in place to promote diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, service providers are lagging behind that, but not far. It's a majority of them already. And on top of that 53% that you see there, a further 16% are planning to implement them in the near future. But things are different externally. Companies are increasingly willing to hold themselves to account for DE&I, but they're not yet willing or able to hold their external partners to the same standards. It's important to acknowledge that over a quarter of the respondents either didn't know how to answer or preferred not to. There's still a ton of uncertainty around this issue, and talking about it remains challenging. I think that if we wonder, like, what do we do with the information that we have? To be honest, I don't think we have enough of it to make any real predictions. I view this as a really valuable baseline, and I think this is a foundation that we can use to help inform future surveys and reports. But I really do hope that this continues to be a vibrant part of our discussion, because the mechanics of how we build great teams and great partnerships, I think is something that everybody here should care deeply about. Now, I'm happy to take any questions on that one, or I can skate on through. What do you think, Chris?
I think people are still churning on that one, Dave. So no questions as of yet.
Okay. All right. So let's talk about some market conditions and trends. And I want to use this last section to pick out just a few highlights. The full report, as I say, will be available to you later today. I can't wait for you to get your hands on it. I would love to talk to you individually or as groups and just get your feedback and dig into any piece of it that you find interesting. So this is just a couple of key pieces that jumped out at me that I wanted to share. This is by no means exhaustive. Okay, to me, this is really interesting. So what you see on the in the graph there is the percentage of service providers who are offering each service, and there's a whole bunch of down arrows there. Now, to be clear, that doesn't mean that fewer services are available for sale. It means that this year's pool of respondents offered fewer services each. In other words, this year's respondents tended to be more niche providers versus multi-service line providers. And this to me also relates back to what we were talking about with mergers and acquisitions. The reality is that the service provider market is really vibrant and really diverse. And it actually seems to be trending away from big multi-service line conglomerates. There's those parties were pretty easy to name, I think, for most of us, seem to be doing their thing and being very successful at it, but don't seem to be stomping on wider diversity within the industry. Something to pick out as well, engineering is up across the board. I really welcome, or I would invite you guys to dig into the engineering numbers, which you'll see in the report. This is a thing that historically has been viewed with a little askance as something that devs would be willing to outsource, and that is dramatically changing. And I think that service providers are responding to that as well in how they offer that service. This to me is really interesting in that I think this year we have reached what I would sort of characterize as a tipping point, that external art development is art development. For the vast majority of game studios, there's no such thing as art without external development. So what you're seeing here is the percentage of companies that are sending, of devs that are sending art outside the studio. This is partial or complete. So this doesn't mean they don't have internal art teams. It just means they're using external partners to help support them. The reality is, for most developers, game development without external support simply isn't an option. Now, why I wanted to pull this out is that this helps explain why a lack of availability remains such a top concern for devs. It explains anxiety about market consolidation. It explains how COVID-19's disruption to the established way of doing things is so threatening. Quite simply, developers and publishers need external art pipelines to work. They don't have an alternative to this process being successful and vibrant and churning out new content. And so anything that threatens that is hugely of concern to everybody. Also of note, developers' our willingness to outsource 2D has jumped pretty significantly, especially around 2D environment and concept art. And also notably, some things that were sort of in the past seen as difficult to outsource, like UI and UX and VFX, most publishers already rely on at least some support there. And so I realize I've been talking very quickly, so I'd like to leave some time for questions, because we're kind of getting to the end of this here, and I wanted to leave you with this slide. I think this comparison is a great example of how developers and service providers can be both in sync and really out of sync with each other. The top concerns are identical. Scarcity of talent seems to be entirely justified. Demand for content is way up. Developers have no way to meet that demand without external support. The ways that we normally connect with external support, like conferences, business trips, no longer exist. And thanks to work from home, devs and vendors are willing to hire people from abroad, which means they're starting to increase directly with each other for that talent. Here also you see that shared concern around mergers and acquisition, but I don't think, as we said, that is supported by the data. Based on the data collected, I believe that this concern is actually a symptom of, number one, is actually a symptom of a scarcity of talent. It's a collision of scarcity of talent colliding with the demand for more content. And after the top two, however, concerns diverge significantly. Developers are clearly focused on things that are helping them to automate to become more efficient. Network security, I think that has a very clear line to work from home measures, where we used to be able to rely on security audits and certifications. Now we're working with dozens in some cases of service providers. We work from home. Our ability to monitor security is really threatening. And then it's interesting to see that diversity, equity, and inclusivity have really entered the top five of concerns that they care about. For service providers, I think that the concern around pricing and new competition from developing markets is warranted. It's logical, but you can see that's a place where it's less something that the devs are going to care about. Is that there's more like this is a concern for service provider could almost be a benefit to the developers there. I think it's totally worth calling out. The service providers that are consistently afraid of being undervalued. However, I will say that doesn't appear to be the case because there is such high demand. One of the things that's really the sort of a side note that I wanted to call out is that for the first time, service providers have seen a huge jump in cold calls from developers in how they meet their partners. So, one of the sections that we gather some data on is how people are meeting their partners. And it used to be, conferences, work, travel, referrals, and referrals are still play a huge factor, but something that's changed dramatically for service providers is just devs showing up on their doorstep and asking for their help. And the fifth one, a potential drop in demand. I think I come from the service provider side. Before I worked at Phoenix Labs, I worked for a service provider. Drop in demand is always a worthy concern, but based on the data that we have so far, I don't think that is something that they should be concerned about. And I'll just leave you with this. 83% of developers have experienced an increase in demand in 2020 for external partners. The past year has tested us as an industry, but it's really clear from the data we have that we didn't just survive, like we continue to absolutely thrive. And thank you.